Good afternoon. For anyone who's listening, this is High Point Mayor Jay Wagner calling to order our High Point City Council special meeting for October 19th. Here at Council Chamber, I am present, as are Councilman Holmes, Jones, and Hudson. Councilwoman Peters, I believe, is also listening to us online, although not physically present here at Council. Everyone else has conflicts, so because there's not a quorum in the room, we will not be able to take any action today, but we can hold the meeting. So with that, I think the first, are we going to do airport first? Okay, so Heidi, we're going to look at the airport overlay issue first.
Thank you. I am Heidi Galante, Planning Services Administrator with the Planning and Development Department, and I'm going to just take a very brief time to give you just a summary of where we left off at your last meeting on September 19th. And I'm going to be bouncing around a presentation that we gave you on the 19th. And this first screen is showing you the proposed amendments with the acreage changes. But staff looked at the latest Part 150 study and determined that it was an unrealistic long-term metric to use because it was a low tide measurement. If this is used, it would allow residential to develop in an area that would be negatively impacted by airport noise when the high tide returns. So staff alternately looked at the 2040 master plan to guide our recommendations, which led to a recommended reduction of the airport overlay by almost 3,000 acres, as is shown on the screen. This will allow an increased area for residential development closer to the airport than is currently allowed. Now I'm going to jump back a few slides. Oop. Sorry. Right there. No, right there, sorry. And just say that you also heard from Barry Siegel requesting an amendments to zones 1 and 2 to allow multifamily residential. Zone 1 is the most restricted zone. I'm sorry, I'm not on the right map. That's the map I'm looking for, I apologize. And Zone 1 is the most restrictive zone that is closest to the airport, and it does not allow residential or large places of assembly. Zone 2 is the next closest zone, and it also does not allow new residential. The land use plan designates these zones primarily as restricted industrial, which supports a corporate park style of development. Mr. Siegel purchased property in Zone 1 last year, even though residential development was not permitted. Staff feels that allowing residential in these zones defeats one of the main purposes of the overlay district, which is to protect noise-sensitive land uses from the impacts of the airport. Sorry. I'm going to go to, oh, goodness. I wish these had numbers on them. That's where I wanted to be. So, staff then also looked at Greensboro and Guilford County and looked at what they use for their regulations. Greensboro is using the 60 DNL from a previous Part 150 study, and if their Area A metric, which prohibits residential except on 40,000 square foot lots, was applied to High Point, which is shown here, we would not be reducing the area allowed for residential, we would actually be expanding it. And this red line shows you where that same metric that Greensboro used to only allow residential on 40,000 square foot lots. And you can see that Area D is within there, where we're changing it from Zone 2 to 3, which will allow residential, from 3 to 4, which will allow residential, et cetera. Then we also looked at Guilford County, which is also using an old 65 DNL metric that is smaller than Greensboro's Area A, but it would also not allow residential except for 40,000 square foot lots, which covers the majority of High Point proposed Zone 1, including Mr. Siegel's property. As you know, the airport, or High Point receives the bulk of flights, so it gets the bulk of the noise. You asked at your previous meeting to see more information about the flights over Greensboro and Memphis. Mr. Bill Cook from the PTIA and Mr. Kevin Baker and Tom Terrell are all here from the airport, and we do have those maps that he provided if you have questions about those flight paths. And at this point, I will say, do you have any questions for me? And if not, I'll let you all go from here.
Could you go back to the Greensboro map?
Well, yeah. That's what they currently regulate, obviously, because they don't regulate on top of us. So that's why it abruptly stops.
Yeah. But there was, the next map was the one that showed if we use their standard. Is that what you were showing?
Yep. Where'd it go? There it is.
That's it. Explain that to me one more time.
So that is the metric that they use extended over our jurisdiction.
Okay.
So if we were to use their metric, this is how it would impact High Point. And they only allow residential on 40,000 square foot lots within that red boundary. Again, we are much heavier, more heavily impacted than Greensboro, as you can see.
So they allow it, but only on large lots? They allow it, but only on large lots?
Only on 40,000 square foot lots. So basically, a little under an acre, you can have one house.
So it would be the entirety of that inside the red line?
If we were to match what Greensboro did, yes.
Okay, that's what I thought. I just want to make sure I was
Sure.
hearing you right.
Any other questions?
Yes, is the DNL industry standard?
That is not a question for me. That is a question maybe for the airport.
Yeah.
But that is what, again, that is what we look at, that's what Greensboro looks at, that's what Guilford County looks at. Any other questions of me?
Who's up next?
Whoever you would like to be up next.
If we could have.
Who wants to be next?
If we could have 7 or 8 minutes, we would.
Yeah,
be-
go ahead, Tom.
Tom Terrell, 529 West Parkway. It's always nice to stand here and say, I approve of what staff just said. Heidi is exactly right. We are at a low tide, and we are moving very, very quickly to a high tide. And policy on land should reflect that direction in our economic growth. I'm here today with Kevin Baker and Bill Cook from the airport. Mr. Baker is the executive director. Bill Cook is the general counsel, but also former Mayor Bensini is on the Airport Authority Board and spends quite a few hours working to make sure that the airport stays and becomes the economic growth engine that it is. A little bit of perspective here. I had the privilege of representing the Piedmont Triad Airport Authority a year ago when the city of Greensboro was doing exactly what High Point is doing right now. Unfortunately, when a very, very important policy decision was being made, one developer, one owner of one tract of land stepped forward and said, essentially, look at me, look at me, look at my project, and all eyes were diverted over to a project instead of looking at the airport. That same thing has been happening, unfortunately, in this context, where there has been one developer who owns one tract of, or maybe two tracts of land that, as Heidi said very clearly, was purchased at risk, knowing that he could not do with that land at the time of purchase what he is asking to be done now, and asking you to use your powers of government to eliminate and mitigate the risk that he knowingly took last December 1st of 2021. I've just learned in the last week that this person has been meeting with council members and staff very quietly over the last few months, sowing seeds of distrust, seeds of doubt in all the studies that are protecting the land in North High Point, but more importantly, the studies that are protecting the airport from inconsistent and incompatible land uses, which could provide a serious or create a serious conflict as the airport continues to grow. What I've just handed you are 3 documents. The first one is something that a few of you have already seen. It's a chart that compares the Piedmont Triad International Airport with the High Point Furniture Market, so that you can see this is not just a small place where planes come and go. The annual economic impact, according to NCDOT, is $8.6 billion. It is much greater than the High Point market, which is spread out over 30 counties, and that number is expected to rise substantially when new data comes in and that report is updated in just a few months. There's other data there that shows the very critical impact that that airport has on our economy, and that airport's trajectory as an economic growth engine is upward. It is not down, it is up. I'll also have some Q&A on the noise contours to create some very simple, basic facts, and I also provided you with the deed that showed you that this property, in fact, was purchased last December 1st, 2021, completely at risk. I do want to tell you one short story that I think shows you that the airport's concern and the reason that the airport is here today is not for hypothetical reasons. Approximately 40 or more years ago, Stanley Frank, who was a leading figure in developing what became the airport that we know today, learned that there was a proposed residential zoning on the north side of the airport, on the Greensboro side in the county. And he said, do not allow that project to be approved because we have a new runway. It's on the books, it's planned, we just need a user to come in. They voted 3-2 to allow it. In 1999, FedEx announced that it was coming to our airport. FedEx was a game changer, but it might not have been a game changer because litigation started immediately. It wasn't over noise, and I think that needs to be said as loudly as it can be said. These were not noise lawsuits. It was not based in nuisance. It wasn't inverse condemnation. These were lawsuits challenging the environmental permits that were received so that the airport could build the runways and do all of the groundwork to make that runway possible. There were lawsuits filed in our administrative courts. There were lawsuits filed in our state trial courts, a lawsuit in our federal district court that was appealed up to the Fourth Circuit. Fortunately, FedEx stayed with us and did not go to another place where it could immediately set up a hub. Other companies won't do that. Other companies are moving fast. They need a place that is shovel-ready. A year ago, we did not know that Boom was going to come. It had not been announced. A year ago, we did not know that the Toyota mega site was coming. Both of those game-changing companies had to know that when they arrived, they weren't going to be stopped by litigation. Now, to show you that these are not hypothetical issues and that the complaints over noise are not just existing in a hypothetical universe, I'd like to introduce you to Kevin Baker, who is steering the airport in all the right directions, but he can show you where those complaints are coming from in High Point and give you a flavor of them. Kevin, would you?
Can I ask you to pass
Yes,
that?
I will.
Thank you. And it's Kevin Baker, 1000A, Ted Johnson Parkway, 27409. Mr. Mayor, Council, thank you for giving us an opportunity to speak with you. I certainly understand this situation. I think that the Airport Authority and I personally, if you check the references, understand the development community and support the development community. We find it very important, obviously, because of the growth that we want to see at the airport. However, we passionately protect the approaches to all of the runways because, as I'll explain to you in just a second, that's where we could get into problems moving forward, and some of the information Tom just provided to you covers that as well. The drawing that you have in your hand, and this was just printed off of a computer by one of our noise folks, but if you'll hold it like this with the green dots more to the bottom right, what you're looking at are the individual locations where complaints have come from just on the High Point side of the airport over the last 5 years. There have been 481 year-to-date from the beginning of 2018 until today from the High Point area. So, roughly we're looking at about 100 a year. And I would say to you that this is only the tip of the iceberg. These are the people who take the opportunity to pick up the phone and make the phone call or get online and make the complaint. There are many others, I'm quite certain, behind there who have not. Yesterday, it's almost like it played right into my hands as far as this discussion, but we had a number of complaints yesterday. I'd like to read one to you very quickly. And this one comes from a guy who is 9.5 miles north of the airport. This is the comment, and forgive the wording of this, but here's how it starts. Jackasses are flying way too low again. Up your altitude and find an up and day. I'm not sure what that means. I think he meant to say up to date. Approach path and stop making people's lives miserable. This is a guy who built a house 2 years ago, apparently didn't know he was in the flight, exactly in the flight path to runway 23 left, and is now discovering that he's got noise coming over his house. And his comments, he wants us to relocate the entire approach to a runway to solve that. Last night we also had 5 complaints from the same family in the Cardinal, 2 miles away from the runway. Very similar, just on the opposite end of the airport, very similar to the proposed development that we're talking about today. I think that you all know, it's no secret that this airport has, as part of its mission, and our board is represented here today by Bill Bensini, and he can get up here and tell you all of this as well. But we have a stated mission to be an economic development engine for this community, and I think are succeeding in that. I think that's just indisputable at this point. In the last 10 years, the number of people working at the airport has doubled. And today, there are a total of 30,000 jobs that are supported by the airport. I think it's really important also to mention that the average salary on the airport is $75,000, and that's before we did any adjustments for what has happened inflation-wise over the last year. So I'm quite certain that it's higher than that now. The average household income in the High Point area is roughly $50,000. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I think that's pretty accurate. So what we're talking about, and remember, average household income is many times 2 earners. We're talking about single earners on the airport making fully 150%, of what average household income is. So what's the message? Lots of jobs and good jobs. And we have to protect our ability to keep on creating those jobs as we go forward. Every residential unit that gets constructed becomes a risk to us. All the risks that Tom just talked about, the fact that it adds folks who may complain, it adds folks who could be opponents to the environmental issues that we're dealing with as we go through some of these large projects. Tom mentioned the fact that if we were here a year ago, we wouldn't have had these big projects. I'm quite convinced that in a year, we're going to have other projects we'll be talking about. And this is so important to keep our ability to grow. Boone is taking 65 acres. We have 1,000 acres of land, and we're actively marketing that, and we'll continue to do so. And you're going to see the 8,600 on-airport employees and the 30,000 total employees related to this airport grow again exponentially in the next 10 years, in my opinion. It's completely possible and probable that we could see something like an Amazon cargo center. Why wouldn't we? We have got FedEx. FedEx made the decision for all of the business reasons that it felt it should. It's the location, geographically, the road system that we have, the climate that we live in, and that is going to appeal to other businesses that are in that same business. So imagine an Amazon hub being located in here, and how that would change the impact to the area specifically that we're talking about. I won't mention any more. Tom talked about the FedEx environmental impact statement. I will say that it took 42 months to get an environmental impact statement done, largely because of all the discussion that had to occur in the community to get to that point. In today's world, we lose that project probably, because you can't tell a company we'll be ready for you in 42 months and expect to have a win. And so my last point would be that 2, 5, 10, 20 years from now further, the developers will have made their money and will be gone. The builders of the houses will have made their money and will be gone. The realtors who sold the houses will have done the same. And it will be left to the folks who are living there, and they'll be calling the airport, and we'll be having complaints like this one that I read you. And I read you just 2. What we're talking about here is building a small community just south of the airport. And as a result, we would really like that for you all to consider following what staff is recommending. Thank you very much.
Anyone else from the airport or staff? Speak. Mr. Siegel, I see you're here. Would you like the opportunity to be heard today?
If I may.
Sure.
Thank you. Tom, I appreciate the kind words. Our intent was to make sure that everybody understood the information that we received from others that we reached out to try to understand what High Point was doing with regard to what the FAA's guidance was, with regard to what HUD's guidance was, and what the DOD's guidance was. And the information that we received was from certainly gentlemen that I'm sure the airport folks are very familiar with, a fellow named Norrell Stewart. And he shared with us basically information that was that he had garnered from his studies and his knowledge in the industry in terms of basically the criteria that other communities were using, and the FAA was using, and DOD was using, and what HUD was doing. Yes, there's no question we bought that property, and we fully disclosed that to everybody in our discussions, and we took the opportunity to, and we very much appreciate the kindness from the city council members to meet with us, to share with them information, okay, that we had got, okay, from Norrell Stewart and from others. And we openly disclosed to them, okay, made absolutely no secret about, that we bought some property. And as we shared with them, we certainly would consider various alternatives in terms of the development of it, and we certainly felt that residential use was an appropriate use. And we went so far as to suggest the possibility in terms of how to restrict that residential use such that there would be one institutional owner, okay, for the use of that, particularly in Overlay District 1. If in fact the City Council makes a decision to leave everything as is, then certainly we will proceed on at some point in time and develop that property in a different manner other than residential. We did feel that in fairness to the 57 homeowners in Fraser Downs, that an alternative approach would in fact be maybe a more appropriate use of the property rather than having them being surrounded by industrial on both the northern side and the southern side of the airport. It is certainly not our intent to do anything that would in any way jeopardize the potential growth, okay, of High Point, but we also felt that the current plan in motion right now is severely impacting High Point's ability to expand. And what is happening is quite obvious when you drive around, in that there is no restriction, okay, from folks buying the land, okay, and placing a house on it in 1 acre lots. And that's what's happening, is a lot of the land that in fact could be annexed into the city of High Point is in fact being acquired by individuals building individual houses on it, right? And all you gotta do is drive around and see that. So we kind of recognized and we wanted to share that information. And obviously we're confident that the city will certainly make the most appropriate decision. With regard to the DNL that Greensboro is using, is of course that you're going back and using the old data in terms of the DNL, okay? And that was one of the things that we saw when we looked at the newest PTI studies in terms of where that DNL limits were, and that DNL limits in terms of 65 was totally occurring within the airport property, okay, even in the 2025 projection. And based upon the information that we had received from Dr. Stewart, it was his comments to us in the report that we shared with everybody, that he was a little surprised that even in the information gathered by High Point in terms of the NA, that there was absolutely no projections in there for a 2040 DNL level of 65 that would in fact cross over Interstate 40. And his comment was to us that, even as reported in his letter to us, that he would be very surprised if in fact that 65 DNL contour would go over the interstate. All right. And we shared all of that information, and we shared that information with the staff as well. So I think those are really my comments, okay? We have been very, very open from day one. We felt that certainly, sure, we think the piece of property that we bought would be a better use for it, would be a residential rental type of facility. If in the event that there is no plan from the city to make any changes, then certainly at some point in time we'll do something else with it. That, you know, that's no big deal. But I would just like to say that while we appreciate everything the airport has done, and we do appreciate that people will complain about anything and everything, we just think that there's probably some merit for City Council to give consideration as to what they can do, okay, with all of this property that is now being basically gobbled up by individual homeowners buying, okay, 1 acre tracts, 2 acre tracts, 3 acre tracts, whatever it is, and placing a house on it. And hence will make the ability for High Point to ultimately annex and develop that property economically viable. And Tom, I do appreciate the comments. And we've been around for a long time, and hopefully Tom knows that we are not bad people, okay? And we do understand where the airport authority is coming from, but we felt it was our responsibility to make sure that the city council members understood all of the information, and that's what we tried to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Eagle. Is there anybody else who'd like to be heard on this? Okay, anybody on council have any questions before we move on to our next topic?
So that's the end for the airport facility part of the meeting?
I assume.
So, I mean, we could talk it more in depth, but it just sounds to me like the airport wants us to keep it a little more restricted. However, that limits the ability for any residential options in those areas. So by loosening those restrictions, the airport could potentially get more complaints. But, I mean, you've been to a lot of these conferences, NLCs and stuff. I mean, there's cities where people live 50 feet from a train tracks, and they hear right out their window. I mean, what do you feel, you've been on this council a lot longer?
Well, I think what we're doing, though, is what has been proposed is not as restrictive as what we have now.
Correct.
But it's, more restrictive than Mr. Siegel wants. That's kind of where we are. So I mean, I just think we have to weigh where we are and where future development's going to go. I think there's been a general understanding among council members and staff for at least the time that I've been on council that the best use for the area is industrial. Now, that was one of the reasons I asked a question when we had the first public hearing was, there are different things that can affect that. You have new technological improvements in building techniques. There's a lot of things that can happen that can soundproof a building better than maybe we were building houses 30 years ago. So I think we have to weigh all of those kinds of things in making the determination that we're making. Because it is a question not just of what's going to happen to the airport, but what is development in the city going to look like in the future. And we do know that we have a housing issue. We do have need for more housing, so
Yeah.
it's up to us to set policy about where that housing is going to go and what type of housing it's going to be. Now, even if we approve this, Heidi, one potential question that some council members might have is, and it's something actually that Mr. Siegel alluded to, so much of this property is not in the city of High Point, it's in the county. And unless they come and ask us to annex them, they're not going to be in the city of High Point because we can't involuntarily annex anymore, really. So, could you speak to the potential of people buying this land and putting houses on acre-sized lots and developing residentially anyway? And because that's going to limit our ability for it to be annexed into the city and being industrial or commercial, something other than residential.
Well, it is private property, right?
One second.
Sorry.
To add one more piece, this is Tasha Logan Ford, City Manager. It might also be helpful for council to understand that if that property is annexed into the city, what the Land Development Code would allow to be built there based on our current standards. That might also help address
Yeah.
the question.
So twofold. So first of all, yes, private property rights. So if somebody purchases the land and they want to build a single-family home and they want to do it in the county and they can get their land to perk, do well in septic, they can do that. As we were formulating these recommendations, Sandy Dunbeck and I drove around some of these areas. The Area D that we have proposed to do just a small plan amendment to allow for residential on the southern piece, we specifically said we're going to leave that northern piece as it is, as restricted industrial. There are large lots there. There's potential for one user to go in there and do some restricted industrial corporate park type uses. So we did look at that. Going to what our land use plan says, It's not our development code, but it is our land use plan, which is our guide for future growth and development. The majority of this is restricted industrial. That is where we have said restricted industrial should go closest to the airport, not only because of the noise, but because of the convenience of being close to the airport and the services that the airport provides. Don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, well, I think so. I mean, it's just more information. Ultimately, it's, each of the 9 of us is going to have to make a decision on what we want and what we think is the proper land use in that area. So this is more of a, it's more of a long-term thing that we're talking about. We're not talking about just one development and what the impact of that one development might be, but really what potential land use is going to be in that area for the next generation even.
Correct.
This is Councilman Holmes. Any private owner who purchases land in that area, they could still pose the same legal challenges to the airport as a developer would, wouldn't they?
I think I need to turn that to the airport to answer.
You can answer that in a variety of ways, but every single person who goes out there is an additional risk. Noise, what we have learned over the centuries, noise is very subjective in how people hear it, respond to it, how it bothers them, doesn't bother them. So when you have one person as opposed to 100 people, it's probably not a mathematical formula that it's 1/100th of the risk. But you see where I'm going with that? The greater you have out there, the greater the numbers of people who could come together, as I like to look at it, as not someone being angry, but someone being a litigant.
Well, with that, I think we're scheduled to bring this back to the full council on November 7th. So, be thinking about it.
I will say, I went out today. I have a distributor out there, and I just sat in his parking lot. He's on this map, he sits on this northeast corner of the green complaints. So it's not quite in the path of the airport. I'm an artist and a designer, and when I look at numbers and D&Ls and charts and things, it's not my forte. 65 decibels to me, I'm also a musician, so 65 decibels is about, this is probably 65 decibels. And in the 30 minutes that I sat in the parking lot, 6 planes flew overhead. This is probably 1 o'clock in the afternoon today. 6 planes flew overhead, and they were loud. I mean, they're noticeable. If it was my yard and I was sitting on my deck, it would bother me. It's not as Tom Terrell says, it is very subjective. For me, I would notice it. If I was inside the house, maybe not, but it would concern me. So I do recommend that you go sit out there and actually see what this is like. It's hard to equate what 65 decibels over a certain time period average means, but I would recommend go and see what this area is actually like.
There's an app for that, too.
Sure there. Yeah.
You can measure decibels on your smartphone.
I promise when a cargo plane, which flew over me, that was not 65 decibels.
I could tell you it's furniture
That's
market.
because the incident is always much higher. The 65 is an average.
Correct. If one plane flies over once a day and it's at 120 decibels, well, I'm sure that average is a lot lower than that, but it's pretty high, still a pretty high event.
Well, I can assure you with Market being in town, I got plenty of time sitting at the airport, so.
Okay, well, let's move on then, because we have a public safety meeting that's supposed to start at 4. So let's move on to our ARP discussion, please.
Good afternoon, Mayor, members of the council. This will be just a kind of a refresher on similar presentations we've done in April and July. Steve Haverlook, Financial Services Department, the Budget and Performance Manager. And so just, again, as a refresher, High Point's allocation of American Rescue Plan funds is $22,699,511. That has been received in 2 tranches. The city has received both those payments from the federal government. To date, we have committed / spent a little over $8.8 million, $5.8 million for critical capital needs. That was done last February. And then $3 million for 300 Oak, and that was approved by council in May. Remaining unspent and committed funds, a little over $13.8 million. Just a reminder, American Rescue Plan funds must be obligated by December 31st, 2024, and they must be spent by December 31st, 2026. This is just a pie chart showing pretty much the same information I just showed. So of our unassigned or unspent funds, about 61% of the total allocated to the city. Just a reminder, back last November, 2 community input sessions were held. The bubble kind of were general themes that came from those community input sessions, but they are not meant to show any priority order. Several council priority projects have been identified as we've kind of gone through this process for the last about year and a half. Those projects include a local match for the homeless shelter, targeted neighborhood improvements, the Foxwood Meadows alternate access project, and 300 Oak, and that's in addition to the $3 million that's already been allocated for 300 Oak. I will note on Foxwood Meadows, property has been acquired and a construction contract has been awarded for that project, and so any funding allocated toward that would be reimbursed to the Stormwater Fund, which is fronting the dollars so that project could move forward. If council were to just hypothetically allocate ARP funds for all of these projects, that would bring the unspent balance of ARP funds to a little bit over $6.2 million. And that's not a recommendation, that's just for your reference on kind of the scale of the council priority projects.
Can you go back one, please, before you go forward?
Right here.
One more. So it looks to me like 300 Oak is listed twice.
So that project was originally the local match for the Build Back Better grant, which was not received. And so this would be an additional $3 million toward portions of that project. And so it's listed twice, but it's for different. This $3 million was for land acquisition. The other $3 million you see later is for additional for that project. And so it's just coincidental that it's the same amount.
So we are spending $6 million? Okay.
Potentially.
Potentially, I thought, okay. So it's not a redundant $3 million, it's a
No.
total $6 million.
Yeah, $3 million has been allocated and earmarked for that already.
Okay, understand.
Lastly, just outside requests. There have been kind of 2 forms of outside requests we've received. The 2 forms are pretty much whether there's a specific proposal or dollar amount associated with it, or if there's general interest. And so those that have a dollar amount or kind of a detailed proposal, we've listed those out, subtotaling a little bit over $7.1 million. And then we've listed out agencies that have requested that are interested in funds or would apply for funds if there was an application process. Those include Servants Heart Worship Center, West End Ministries, Ready Ready, Reading Connections, World Relief Triad, American Home Furnishings Hall of Fame, and Caring Services. But we'll note that that list is not reflective of all agencies that may be interested. If there were an application process, we would want to notify all community partners that there was an opportunity to apply. And that concludes my portion of the presentation. I'd be happy to answer any
Can you go back
questions.
just one more slide?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I do believe at one of the meetings that we held during the summer, we had outlined a potential process for council to consider if there was an interest in putting out a process for community agencies to apply for funding. The timing for that, based on funds need to be committed by December of 2024. We want to make sure that we're having the conversation if council would like to move in that direction. because we would want to make sure that we have enough time to put an application out, give agencies the opportunity to respond, and then for council to have enough time to deliberate and determine how that funding would be allocated. So at this point, there's not a decision that needs to be made, but if there are thoughts or ideas that council has in terms of whether or not we're going to have a community agency process, or whether at least the projects that have been identified as council priorities, if we're comfortable with that, because some of those are starting, then that would be helpful for staff to know that there at least is a level of commitment for Foxwood Meadows, and that we're kind of already committed with 300 Oak, and that will really give council an understanding of what might be left for a community agency process if we chose to take that route. And if there's any other additional information that we need to provide at a future meeting, you just let us know.
Can I ask, on the application, there's a difference in a project that needs the total funding or that we're just helping? Can we make that distinction? If we don't give total projects off, we
You could, that could be part of the criteria that you
think
use to
that's
evaluate.
important.
So you're saying if there's $1 million project and they need all million, or they don't get it done at all?
Yeah.
Let us know that.
Well, I mean, Patrick Harmon's here, I'm not going to put him on the spot.
Right, right.
But, you know, his project is a very specific
All or nothing.
part, but if he gets $1 million, would he say, well, we can use $1 million and just continue on? Yeah, his project I know is building, so he'll, pretty much whatever we can give, they'll take, but some projects may be all or nothing. And congratulations on that too, that's great news, great news.
Well, and another thing too, folks, I think this is one-time money. So I think we need to be very careful that we're giving it for building or capital projects, that we're not giving it for operating. You, as an entity, you've got to be able to, you know, I know these are nonprofits, but they're, you have to be able to earn enough money to operate your business, even if it's a nonprofit. So what I think, one thing I think we need to guard against is giving a large sum of money to an entity that's going to be able to put that money into a capital project, but then doesn't have the ability to function afterwards. So we need to be very careful as we evaluate these requests that that these various entities are financially secure, that they're going to be able to function beyond or into the future. Because, you know, sometimes your entity is able to function at the level that it is, but as you become larger, you're not able to scale up. And so it's a risk. And it's just something I think, I'm not pointing at any specific entity because I really don't know enough about them, but I just think it's something that we need to be cognizant of as we make those decisions, that we're taking into account financial security of the entities and their ability to scale up. Thank you. Anything else? Nope. Okay. Well, we got 7 minutes then until the Public Safety Committee meeting meets. So if anybody wants to hang out and talk about public safety, you're welcome to do that. Do I have to have a motion to adjourn for a meeting that isn't, where we don't have a quorum? I don't think so. I don't think so.